I've lived long enough to understand that time doesn't just pass, it teaches. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, through moments you don't realize are important until they're long behind you. I've seen applause and emptiness share the same room. I've known noise that meant nothing and silence that said everything. On the night that changed me, nothing unusual happened at first. No warning, no thunder.
Just a house resting in stillness, the kind that settles around you when your life has already told most of its stories. I sat alone, not searching for answers, just relief from the weight of memory. I opened an old book, not out of habit or duty, but because some part of me was tired of carrying the world alone. Somewhere between thought and rest, my eyes closed, and that's where the line blurred.
I wasn't asleep the way people usually mean it. I was aware but unguarded. I found myself standing in a presence that didn't demand attention. It commanded it. The light around me wasn't bright in the way the sun is bright. It didn't strain my eyes. It settled into me. It felt heavy with meaning, like truth without words. And in that place, I understood something before it was ever said. I was not alone, and I was not there by accident. The figure before me didn't announce itself. There was no title, no introduction, no need.
Recognition doesn't always come from familiarity. Sometimes it comes from memory older than thought. I felt known, completely, uncomfortably, and gently, not judged, seen. And in that moment I realized how rare that feeling was, how often we walk through life armored, unseen even by ourselves. I wanted to speak, but my voice didn't belong to me anymore. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It was honesty.
Because when you stand before something that understands you fully, there's nothing clever left to say. The presence didn't rush me. It waited, as if time itself had slowed out of respect.
Then, without accusation or praise, a truth unfolded, not as a command, but as an invitation to finally understand what I had been looking at my whole life, without ever truly seeing. When the presence spoke, it wasn't with sound the way we expect sound. It moved through me, steady and calm, carrying the weight of certainty without force. I was told that seeing the world isn't the same as understanding it.
That a lifetime can pass behind a window where you witness movement without ever touching meaning. I realized then how often I had confused observation with wisdom. How easy it is to believe you know people simply because you've watched them from a distance. I was shown a world shaped by differences, faces, histories, tones of voice, inherited pain. But instead of lines dividing people, I saw something else entirely. Layers. Stories stacked upon stories, each shaped by endurance. I understood that variety was never meant to separate. It was meant to teach. That difference isn't disorder, it's design. And somewhere along the way, humanity forgot that. What struck me hardest wasn't the suffering I was shown. It was the resilience. I was drawn to a people who had carried unbearable weight and yet refused to surrender their spirit. They had turned grief into rhythm, struggle into movement, sorrow into something that still reached upward.
Not because they were spared pain, but because they learned how to survive it, without letting it hollow them out. That kind of strength doesn't come from comfort. It's forged. I felt something tighten inside me as I realized how often the world misunderstands endurance. How easily it overlooks quiet dignity. How suffering, when carried with grace, is too often mistaken for weakness.
I understood then that history had failed not because pain existed, but because compassion had been selective. The presence didn't scold me. It didn't list my mistakes. It simply revealed the cost of indifference.
I saw moments where silence had been easier than honesty, where distance felt safer than empathy. And I understood that neutrality, when faced with injustice, is not peace, its absence. I was shown that every human being carries a mark of intention, that no life is an accident, that dismissing a person because of how they look is not just cruelty, it's a refusal to recognize craftsmanship.
And in that realization, something inside me gave way. Not guilt, responsibility. The kind that doesn't ask for punishment, only action. I wanted to look away, not because what I was shown was wrong, but because it was undeniable. Truth has a way of undoing you when you can no longer pretend ignorance. I felt exposed, not in shame, but in clarity. The presence drew closer, not by moving, but by deepening.
And I understood that proximity isn't measured in steps, but in attention. I was shown how faith had survived in places where hope should have died.
How songs were born in sorrow and still managed to lift the heavens. How forgiveness had been offered by those who were never given an apology. That kind of mercy isn't learned in safety, it's earned in fire. I realized that spiritual strength doesn't always look quiet or polite. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it looks like joy that refuses to ask permission.
The truth settled into me slowly. Pain does not erase purpose. And suffering, while never chosen, can still become sacred when it is carried with love. I saw how often the world demands proof of worth from those who have already paid too much. How survival itself becomes invisible once it becomes expected.
Then I understood something that stayed with me long after I woke. To dismiss a person's humanity is to misunderstand creation itself. Every life reflects intention. Every difference reflects care. And when we reduce people to labels, we strip meaning from the very thing that makes us human.
I felt my own history rise up in me, moments where I benefited from comfort without questioning its cost, where convenience replaced curiosity, where familiarity dulled empathy. The presence didn't accuse me of cruelty, it showed me the quiet ways blindness forms. And then I was given a choice, not spoken, but understood. Awareness is useless unless it changes behavior. Insight means nothing unless it leads to humility.
Seeing is not the end, it's the beginning. When I awoke, the room was the same, but I was not. The darkness felt softer, the air heavier. I noticed tears on my hands before I remembered crying. Not the dramatic kind, just the quiet release of something long held. I sat there for a long time, listening to the world wake up. Every sound felt deliberate. Every moment felt borrowed. I didn't rush to explain what happened. Some experiences aren't meant to be argued. They're meant to be lived. I carried the words with me like a pulse, steady and insistent. And as the days passed, I began to notice how much I had missed before. Faces I had seen 100 times now carried stories I'd never bothered to imagine. I watched people move through their lives with a new awareness, not suspicion, not pity, but respect. I saw strength where I once saw routine, grace where I once saw struggle.
I realized how often dignity hides in plain sight, overlooked, simply because it is learned not to ask for attention. It became clear to me that awakening isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with certainty or comfort. It comes with discomfort and responsibility. Because once you see clearly, you can't return to ignorance without choosing it.
I understood then that the message I'd been shown wasn't limited to one group or one injustice. It was about vision, about recognizing the divine imprint in every person, especially where the world insists on seeing less. And slowly, without announcement, my behavior began to change. I listened more. I spoke less.
I questioned assumptions that once felt harmless. I learned that respect is not passive. It is active, deliberate, and constant. As weeks passed, the understanding I carried didn't fade. It sharpened. It worked its way into ordinary moments, the kind most people rush through without noticing. I found myself watching people more closely, not out of curiosity but reverence.
Every face felt like a chapter instead of a surface. I began to realize how much courage it takes simply to exist in a world that often measures worth through convenience and familiarity. Strength, I learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just keeps showing up. I noticed how certain people carried history in their posture, how endurance lived quietly in their movements. Not bitterness, awareness.
The kind that comes from surviving things you were never meant to endure alone. I understood then that joy, when it appears in those lives, is not naïve. It's defiant. It's chosen.
That kind of joy is a declaration that suffering did not win. What struck me most was how little recognition that strength receives. The world applauds success but rarely acknowledges survival. We celebrate victories while ignoring the resilience required just to remain standing. I realized that this blindness isn't always intentional. It's inherited, passed down through habits, assumptions, and unchallenged narratives.
And once I saw that, I could no longer excuse my own participation in it. I thought often about how easily people categorize one another, how quickly complexity is flattened into stereotypes, how fear disguises itself as opinion. I recognized moments in my own life where comfort kept me quiet, where silence felt easier than confrontation.
Not because I believed injustice was right, but because it wasn't happening to me. That realization sat heavy, but necessary. The message I had been given wasn't about guilt. It was about responsibility.
Awareness without action is just another form of avoidance. I began to understand that compassion isn't an emotion. It's a discipline. It requires effort. It requires humility. And most of all, it requires listening without preparing a defense. I started choosing my words more carefully, not to sound wise, but to avoid causing harm through carelessness.
I learned that respect doesn't begin with agreement, it begins with acknowledgement. And slowly I felt myself stepping out from behind the window I'd lived behind for so long, finally willing to enter the frame. There was a moment, months later, that brought everything into focus. I was sitting in a small public place, nothing special, just a pause in the day.
Around me, life unfolded the way it always does. Conversations overlapping, footsteps passing, people carrying invisible burdens. And for the first time, I felt fully present in it all. Not separate, not observing, participating.
I watched a young man nearby, clearly exhausted, shoulders heavy, eyes determined. No one noticed him. No one needed to. But I did. And it struck me how often the most powerful stories are lived without witnesses. How many people carry strength not for recognition, but because they have no other choice. That was when I understood something essential. Seeing someone does not require permission.
It requires intention. And once you begin, you can't stop noticing how much humanity has been overlooked. I realized the awakening I experienced wasn't meant to isolate me into private reflection. It was meant to change how I moved through the world, how I responded when people spoke dismissively, how I challenged narratives without turning conversations into battles. Truth, I learned, doesn't need volume. It needs consistency. There were moments when speaking up felt uncomfortable. Moments when silence would have been easier. But I remembered what I'd been shown. Comfort is often the enemy of growth. And real compassion asks something of you. It costs pride. It costs certainty. Sometimes it costs approval. I wasn't trying to change the world. I was trying to change my corner of it, to be deliberate where I had once been passive, to replace assumptions with curiosity, to recognize that every person I encountered carried a story shaped by circumstances I would never fully understand. And that realization brought peace, not the kind that avoids tension, but the kind that comes from alignment, knowing your actions reflect your understanding. For the first time, I felt awake in a way that wasn't exhausting. It was grounding, like finally standing on solid ground instead of drifting through habit. I eventually shared parts of what I'd experienced, not as an explanation, but as an offering. I didn't frame it as certainty or revelation, just a moment that changed how I see people. Some listened, some didn't, and that was fine. Truth doesn't require consensus to be true. What mattered was that the message landed where it needed to. I saw it in quiet nods, in thoughtful pauses, in conversations that didn't end where they began. I learned that awakening is contagious, but only when shared without arrogance. The moment you try to force insight, it stops being insight and becomes noise.
There were those who misunderstood my intentions. Some accused me of overthinking, others of inviting division by naming it, but avoiding discomfort had never healed anything. Ignoring fractures doesn't make structure stronger, it just hides the damage. I came to understand that justice and compassion are not opposing forces. One without the other becomes hollow. Compassion without honesty becomes sentiment.
Justice without empathy becomes cruelty. Balance lives in seeing people fully, acknowledging pain without reducing them to it.
What stayed with me most was the reminder that every human life reflects intention. Not perfection, but purpose. And purpose doesn't need to be proven through achievement. It exists simply because someone exists. That truth alone dismantles hierarchy. I stopped measuring people by how closely they mirrored my experiences and started honoring how different theirs were.
I learned that empathy grows not from comparison, but from imagination, from the willingness to ask, what if that were me? And slowly the world felt larger, not heavier, richer, more complex, more honest. I no longer felt the need to have the final word. I was content to listen, to learn, to stand corrected when necessary. That, I realized, is what humility looks like, not shrinking, but opening.
Now, when I reflect on that moment that started everything, I don't think of it as a dream or a vision. I think of it as an interruption, a pause placed in my life long enough for truth to catch up with me. It didn't give me answers, it changed my questions. I no longer ask who deserves understanding. I ask who hasn't been given enough of it. I no longer wonder why the world is divided. I wonder how often fear has been mistaken for tradition. What I learned is simple, but not easy. Love is not passive. It is attentive. It notices. It refuses to reduce people to categories.
It insists on seeing the full image even when it challenges comfort. Legacy, I've realized, isn't about recognition. It's about impact measured in quiet ways. How you treated people when no one was watching. How willing you were to change when truth demanded it. It's about whether your presence made space for others to exist fully. I don't claim moral authority. I claim responsibility. To keep my eyes open.
To resist indifference. To remember that every person I meet carries something sacred, whether I understand it or not. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this: the world doesn't need louder voices as much as it needs clearer vision. The moment you truly see another person, not as a symbol, not as a statistic, but as a human being, you can't unsee them. And maybe that's the point, not to fix everything, not to be flawless, but to be awake, to walk through life with the awareness that every face reflects intention, every story deserves respect, and every act of understanding matters more than we realize. That realization didn't make me extraordinary. It made me honest. And that, I believe, is where real change begins.